May these words about bread nourish, strengthen, and develop and grow in all of our lives, all of the time. 1,500 years ago, a church was built on the northeast side of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. 200 years after the church was built, it was burned. Historians don't know what was the cause. It could have been just the spillage of lamp oil, and it caught. Could have been a very hot summer. It could have been something more malignant. We don't like the church. There was a lot of disturbance going on in the Middle East at that time, as there is a lot today. But the church was burned, became rubble. And over the passage of time, people forgot about the church. In 2019, a group of archaeologists in Haifa, Israel, decided we are going up to the Galilee, and we're going over to that northeast quadrant, and we're going to start to dig. We're going to examine that portion of the Galilee. And they did. And amidst all of the digging around and the setting up and whatever archaeologists do, they began to uncover the footprint of this church. And there in the footprint was the evidence of the burning of the church. To this day, that church is known as the Burnt Church. And underneath the ash, in the central part of the church before you enter into the sanctuary, as they took their little brushes, brushed it away, there was a mosaic of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. The ash had preserved the mosaic. Little bits of tile, of pottery, of stone, of glass. An artist had gathered, had something in the mind, and it began to emerge in this mosaic of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Why the 5 loaves and the 2 fish? Well, maybe it was because that up in that territory, this remarkable, miraculous event took place, and they wanted to sort of institutionalize it, make it ours. Could be. Some of the other churches in the Middle East took shape, form from where they were planted. They took on the territory and brought it into the church. I think there's something more, though, with this mosaic of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. It's rather fascinating when you take a look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 3 of them are clustered together. We call them the synoptics. They see things similarly. The 4th, John, sees things differently. Matthew, Mark, Luke. One is an apostle, Matthew. John Mark, a young man, filled with vigor, filled with a sense of call in his own life. He just wants the facts of Jesus' life. Luke, a more patient, scholarly physician. He divides up his book into 4 parts. He tells stories. He reveals Christ. But the one thing that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have in common is this: the feeding of the 5,000 and the cross and the resurrection. The 4 Gospels connect with those 2 moments of the feeding and the cross and the resurrection. Bruce Mill, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, points out that John, the one who knew Jesus, and if you recall, it is Jesus speaking to John and says, from the cross, John, this is your mother. An intimacy, Mary and John. Jesus knew John. And that becomes reflected in the Gospel of John. Milne points out that there are 7 remarkable, miraculous events that are clustered around Jesus' life and are clustered geographically. Some take place in Jerusalem, some take place in Galilee. They're there. But where they join is Galilee with the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. Jerusalem with the cross and the resurrection. And he draws those 2 together. I remember the first time when I read his commentary and I said, that's remarkable. I challenged him and I said, I bet you he hasn't done all the work. Who was I? No, he did the work. This mosaic. So what is it about the feeding of the 5,000 that becomes so attractive to us? It has a timeless dimension to it. I think it's helpful to understand how we get there up on the northeast quadrant of the Sea of Galilee. How we get there. Just prior to this, Jesus has gone on a training expedition with the 12. They were given some instruction. This is what you're to do. This is what you're to say. And when you come into a town and they receive you, stay there. And if they don't receive you, leave. That's what the shaking the dust off of the sandals is all about. It wasn't a vitriolic statement. It wasn't, you people just don't get it and I'm leaving and that's it. It's, you don't want it, you don't get it, we're moving on. They had just come back. Evidently, it was rigorous. And Jesus says, let's go to a sequestered place where essentially we can debrief. That's my term. But that's what was going on with Jesus. He wanted to hear from them. He wanted to engage with them. What did you see? What did you hear? How did it go? Tell me. That's one part of this movement to a sequestered place. The other part is that the disciples of John the Baptist had just told Jesus that his cousin was executed. The merging of euphoria as the 12 come back, all excited but tired, and the devastation of the death of John are there. Let's go to a remote place. The scripture In Luke, let's go to a lonely place, meaning we don't want anybody around. How does that work for us? Moments of euphoria. No, we want to be with our crowd. We don't want anybody around. We have some things to say. There's intimacy there. There is something that is just very special. We don't want anybody crowding in on that. And when a death occurs, the longing to be with those who are alive is very present, but the devastation of the death reveals an emptiness, and I need to go away. I need to be by myself. I need to go to a remote place. Loss. That's the backdrop, because all of that got disturbed. As Jesus says, let's make our way to the remote place. You know where it is. Let's go there. And the people who had listened to Jesus, who had seen some of those remarkable events take place. Once I was blind, now I see. That's the only commentary I can give to you about this man who healed me on the Sabbath. Nobody's here to push me into the pool when the Spirit disturbs the water. I want to walk. I've been here for 38 years and I can't get into the pool. Stand up. And he did. And he walked away. What do you do with something like that? If you were at the pool of Siloam in Bethsaida and that happened, what would you do? You saw this guy here all the time. And now he stands up and he walks away. People saw and people heard Jesus, and they said, we need to see him again. We need to go where he is. And so they invade the remote place. They invade the lonely place, and they're there. What about the 12? Jesus were being followed. And Jesus looks out, and the statement that is found in the Gospels, and he had compassion on them. Jesus' life potentially was being disturbed by a gathering of people, hundreds of them. They wanted a piece of him and a piece of the action. There was a hunger and a thirst inside of their life. They had seen some remarkable things, and they were wondering, is this what has been promised to us? They want to know. Life was hard in Galilee. Very hard. The Romans had seized a portion of Galilee and said, this is the entry point into Jerusalem. We will control the entry point. Where was Matthew? At the entry point, collecting taxes, when Jesus and Matthew had a conversation. Capernaum was a prominent place. It was the narrowing down of the trade route. You had to go through there. And, not surprising, you have people living in Galilee all around Capernaum, Cana, Nazareth, saying, we don't like the Romans. And for that matter, we don't like what's going on down in Jerusalem either. They're all corrupt. And there was a rebellious ferment that was there. So it wasn't an easy life. It wasn't an easy life for the fishermen who had to pay tax upon tax upon tax with their fish. It wasn't easy for farmers. The ground was not that convivial. to farming. This is a hard-scrapple life that these people are living. And so they're looking for something, and they come, and Jesus looks at them, and he has compassion on them. And Philip says, I think they need to return to their villages. I think they need to return to their homes. I mean, we can't do anything about it. They're probably hungry. They're probably thirsty. We don't have anything to offer. Except 5 loaves. They were that big, those loaves, in that boy's lunch. They were made out of barley, not wheat. They were made out of the poor people's flour. 5 of them, and 2 pickled fish, this big. The mosaic has bits and pieces of things to make the bigger picture. Here's some bits and pieces that are coming into this scene. These 5 loaves, these 2 fish. And Jesus says to his disciples, have them sit down. Bring me the 5 loaves, the 2 fish. And he takes the bread and lifts it up, breaks it, and asks for God's blessing. Fast forward, 12 baskets of food are collected after the 5,000 plus people have eaten. If you were living in Galilee at that time, would you not retain that story? I think you would. I think that's what happened in that church. That story got retained, embedded in the lives of those people. And they passed it on from family to family because the families were there. You will never believe what occurred on this day, on that hillside, with this person called Jesus. You'll never believe it, but I'm going to tell you the story once again. And it got repeated. And the bits and the pieces were gathered, and a mosaic occurred. Bits and pieces. Isn't that what our life is? Bits and pieces. Shards. Shards of our personality. Pieces of our experience. Little emblems of success. Fragments of things gone wrong. It's all there. It's bits and pieces. Robert Capon, in his 3-part series about the parables of Jesus, says, in the parables of grace, they are focused on the little, the least, and the lost. Parables of grace. Jesus teaching about grace. Jesus bringing forward grace into a person's life. But it's to the little, it's to the least, and it's to the lost. It's the little, the least, and the lost that have the bits and the pieces. But lest we surmise that it is only the little, the least, and the lost, there are those who have a lot but are lost. There are those who are big but who are really experiencing being little. And there are those who have much, but they know deep out of their own hunger they have less. regardless. The little, the least, and the lost, it applies to us all. And it is Jesus that goes into that arena with the breaking of the bread, the distribution, in an extravagant display of invasive grace in a person's life. Invasive grace. The people weren't satisfied, interestingly enough, with what took place on that hillside. They wanted Jesus to march right into Capernaum and turn over the tax tables. Tell the Romans, back to Rome you go, and make a trek down to Jerusalem and call out the rabbis. That's what they wanted. They wanted the thing to be changed. Jesus would have none of it. He went back into the remote place by himself. They couldn't find him until the following day, on a storm-driven day. Jesus walks across the water to the boat and says to Peter, Peter, if you want to experience God's grace, you've got to get out of the boat. With all the bits and pieces of your life, you've got to get out of the boat. And he does. Loaves and fish, cross and resurrection, they are inextricably woven together, and you can't break the thread that's there. It's there. It's dealing with something that is so profoundly earthly. I'm starving, I'm hungry, I need something to eat. And something so desperately thirst demanding. What's my life about anyway? Where am I going? How should I live? A number of years ago, a song was written. It starts like this: something beautiful, something good. All my confusion, he understood. All I have to offer you is brokenness and strife. But he made something beautiful out of my life. What's the mosaic for us all? How will the bits and pieces be put together? Today, what are we going to eat? Because it doesn't cost anything and it has no price. It's extravagant grace that is available on this day. Amen.